Just a few days ago, there was a little bit of a hubbub discussion of D.C. statehood. That is to say, making the 51st state out of Washington, D.C. erupted, and we got some,
one of my House Republicans,
let's say, primo comments from your boy, Mondaire Jones, Chad Jones over here.
Republican colleague said that D.C. shouldn't be a state because the district doesn't have a landfill. My goodness, with all the racist trash my colleagues have brought to this debate, I can see why they're worried about having a place to put it.
Sick burn. We're now joined by congressional correspondent extraordinaire Chad.
That's cool. I don't care, Chad. You're a fake Chad, virgin. I don't care. Anyway, it's actually pretty rare that in the House of Congress you actually see a direct accusation of racism. It's usually, even with the Democrats, you know, it's usually this canter-wheeling, like, white supremacy is
one of my House Republican colleagues said that...
Stop! I hate news sites. Their video players are trash 24/7. It's rare that you see stuff like that. Now, is that true? They made him retract that? Is that a thing that they did? Because, of course, that's not civil enough. Rules of the... Yeah, you can't call Republicans racist in the House of Congress. That's too accurate. It's too correct. It's too based and red-pilled. See, here's the issue, folks. Okay? Let's take a look at the wonderful, what would you call it? Unincorporated? It's not an unincorporated territory. The stateless province, federal district of Washington, D.C. Have you ever been to Washington, D.C.? I have. I got held up by the Secret Service there once because I was walking around with my friends as a tourist, loudly inquiring as to what kind of security apparatuses they have implemented there, you know? Washington, D.C. has about 700,000 people in it, which makes it larger than several states. It's an industrious, well-populated, and civilly relevant portion of our country. But it is not a state. And there are consequences to that. Now, the folks in D.C. are allowed to vote on federal elections, but because they are not a state, they do not get 2 senators, and they do not get the 3 House of representatives that they would get were they a state. Washington, D.C. has more people than several other existing states. Like Wyoming has fewer people than... Wait, is it 1 House seat? Oh, God, am I faltering? Wait, did I mix up how many reps would be in total? Oh, no. One House plus 2 senators. Okay, I was thinking in my head 3 representatives, so I thought like 2... Yeah, okay, 3 House representatives. Yeah, okay, my bad. There you go, people. Correcting the lefty misinfo. I made the exact same mistake yesterday, okay? So, yeah, he's telling on destiny. Folks, D.C. statehood is an extremely important issue for a number of reasons, okay? Now, as states go, it would be an exceptionally small one in terms of land area, but the enfranchisement of its population is important because the denial of statehood to the 700,000 odd people in Washington, D.C. is what I would call a constitutional failure. It is by far the largest group of disenfranchised people in what is known the continental United States. Of course, Puerto Rico has like 3 million people in it, but that's also something we got to work on. In D.C., the reason why they do not have statehood is because back when the United States was founded, they built the capital, the federal capital, on a swamp. Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp, okay? And at the time, because it was a fairly unlivable and unprosperous area, the only people who lived in the federal capital, the only people who lived in D.C., were people who were directly involved in the operation of the federal government. Now, I said this before, but I'll say it again. I want you to imagine 200 years ago, okay? Washington, D.C. was not some gigantic, prosperous city. What it was a collection of federal buildings, trade posts, and roads that ran outwards. It's meant to have been, situated roughly in the middle of the 13 colonies for easy access, north and south. And the people who lived there were basically just senators, congresspeople, president, presidential aide, bodyguards, everyone associated with the operation of the federal government. So their logic was, if they made Washington, D.C. a state, you know what would happen? Well, that state would be almost entirely beholden to the interest of the federal government. In essence, it would be a pocket state. The federal government would have basically direct control over the operation of the state. And back then, states' rights, I guess as they are still today, a very important point, the idea of the federal government basically just having a pocket state, you know, wasn't something that they were too keen on. They thought it would be unfair. So D.C. was a special area, a bit of an exemption, and they kept it as was, not a state. Nowadays, it has 700,000 people. And the arguments for enfranchising the state are, at least from our end, both moral and pragmatic. So, morally speaking, the fact that you can live in Washington, D.C., and know for a fact that in spite of the fact that you are closer to the federal government than anybody else, you actually have less influence as a voter than anybody else in the United States, because you do not get to contribute a senator or a congressperson or a representative. You're right there. I mean, you can see the buildings. When you wake up in D.C., you take a look at that skyline. Look at this. There are apartment buildings not too far off from the from our esteemed federal institutions. You can wake up, you can go outside, you can, pop a squat, do a big old stretch, look over at the skyline and see, what's that? Oh my God, is it the most powerful institutions on the planet? Just sitting right over there? The ones that I don't get to contribute to? Huh? Weird. I mean, again, 700,000 people. This is not a small number of people. Morally, I think it's reprehensible that they do not have that option. They don't have that power. Pragmatically, because let's be real, that's what we're talking about here. Pragmatically, if Washington, D.C. were made a state, that would be 2 more blue senators. The state of D.C. is more Democrat-leaning than any other state or potential state in existence in the United States. I think it goes, generally speaking, about 90 to 95% in favor of Democrats every federal election, which is insane. I mean, that is wildly beyond any proportion. I mean, what is California? Isn't California like 66-34 or something like that? DC is like exponentially more blue than California. We say like New York, blue stronghold, okay? DC makes New York look like a Texas country club, okay? That was built on top of a former plantation, all right? That's how blue DC is. That state is blue, okay? Fundamentally. I'm not going to lie. It would be really nice to have 2 more blue senators, a blue rep. It would also make potential future constitutional amendments maybe a little bit more favorable for our side. I'm not going to lie. That is something that I like the sound of. The problem is Republicans do not want Washington, D.C. to be made a state. The measure to pass just went through the House. It's going to die in the Senate. Has it already died in the Senate, by the way? I'm not even keeping track because there's a 0% chance that any Republican will ever vote for Washington, D.C. to be a state. Yeah, okay. Dead on arrival. Yeah, it might as well. There's no point in paying attention to it whatsoever. Don't even follow it, okay? Because if Republicans passed D.C.'s statehood, they would be hamstringing themselves. It's the same reason why they will never get rid of the Electoral College, because it is necessary for them to have a shot in federal elections. They need it. They need it to have a shot at the presidency. It is a huge handicap in their favor. Now, what's interesting to me is that the arguments Republicans have made against the statehood of D.C. are almost identical to anti-democratic arguments that have been made in the past against suffrage for women and against the enfranchisement of slaves. So We saw earlier that little clip, the one where the Republicans were called racist, and he had to retract that statement. Um, and some of you who saw stream yesterday may have seen the clip where that white Republican said, DC isn't a diverse, can somebody provide that clip? Yeah, I'll find it on, what was it, Bastiat's Twitter, if I have to. It's too good, The word salad that gets pulled out here. See, Washington, D.C. is something like 50% black. I mean, Washington, D.C., I think, might be the least white state, if you're, maybe, possibly? Hold on, here we go.
But yes, Wyoming is smaller than Washington by population, but it has 3 times as many workers in mining, logging, and construction, and 10 times as many workers in manufacturing.
You will notice that this has nothing to do with the legitimacy of statehood. More people work in manufacturing? What the fuck does that have to do with making a territory a state? What possible relevance could that have?
In other words, Wyoming is a well-rounded, working-class state.
Oh, they're doing the meme. This is one of the this is the Nas Bull argument, though of course we're dropping the Nas. No, we're keeping the Nas and dropping the Bull. Sometimes people will say working class when what they actually mean is white factory worker. That is what they mean. Quick reminder, oh my God. Quick reminder, by the way, hot tip, the real working class of America, the purest working class of America, has always been people of color. Whether you're talking slavery, which, yeah, that would put them in that category, not in a capitalist sense, but at the very least in terms of the relation to their labor and ownership of the means of production. Whether you're talking that to the inner cities, which have always been the most industrious and economically productive portions of our country, to the sharecroppers, black sharecroppers that didn't have anywhere else to go after the end of slavery. People say working class. Very often they mean white. Working class has dipped pretty heavily into this weird racialized language. It doesn't really track if you think about it for like 5 seconds. When people think working class, they think of like white factory workers. I don't know, like why? Why wouldn't you think, like, why is that what people go to? Blue collar America. Why? Well, the reason why is because this language has largely been co-opted by the Republican Party. When has the Republican Party ever stood for the worker? Seriously. But it gets used over and over and over again by their politicians. Trump, back in 2015, 2016, pushed for this all the time. The working class, the oil, the coal miners, our auto industry, the Rust Belt, that sort of thing. Trump pushed for that. Did any of Trump's policies actually benefit these people? I mean, he brought back, what, a couple thousand jobs? And I think those ended up getting closed down later anyway. It was one of his biggest talking points, the whole Rust Belt working class,
One Senate Republican said that D.C. wouldn't be a, quote, well-rounded working class state. I had no idea there were so many syllables in the word white.
Unfathomably based. Unimaginably based. Imperceptibly based. Because that's what it is. It's a dog whistle. Similar arguments were made back during the suffragette movement, ye back a century ago. People made the argument that, we don't need to give women the vote because they'll only double their household vote, the vote of their husbands. Oh, women don't need the vote because they should keep their mind off, that sort of things. Oh, that's like over and over. These arguments were very, very common. But do you know the actual reason why they made those arguments? They didn't want women to have the vote because women would generally vote for more progressive candidates, and the people making those arguments were reactionary. That's it. That's the only reason. It was realpolitik. In reality, nobody really has a principled stance on this. People are only looking out for their own power. And by people, I mean Republicans, because only Republicans are smart enough to act out of realpolitik. Democrats adhere to principles, like idiots. Republicans will never, ever, ever agree to the statehood of D.C., no matter what arguments are made, because it will politically disadvantage them. And Democrats, I mean, it varies. I would be willing to enfranchise D.C., even if it were majority Republican, because I'd like to think that I'm not a massive hack. But the Democratic Party as a whole, I'll put it this way, okay? If Washington, D.C. voted 95% red, the Republicans already would have passed D.C. statehood, and half the Democrats would have voted for it as well. Okay? You know? I'll put it that way, okay? Very different approach how we handle these types of situations. They did the same thing with slavery, by the way, too. There were a lot of people. Hey, who here's watched the cinematic classic, Birth of a Nation? There was a fear that after black people could vote, that they would vote themselves into every facet of our federal and state, offices, and that slowly I can't even use the terminology they used back then. Slowly I'll just say blackified. America would become blackified. The argument that they would use back then was a more honest and explicit representation of their actual beliefs. Back in those days, they could just openly say, we don't want these people to be able to vote because we don't like them. Their power is not our power. But nowadays, they have to dress it up. Nowadays, it has to be, oh, well, Washington, D.C. has 1/10 as many manufacturing workers as Wyoming. Like, what the fuck does that mean? They have to dress it up a little bit. But if you stripped aside the mask, Republicans would say, yeah, Washington, D.C., they have too many black people, and they vote too Democrat. We don't want them to have senators. That's pretty much it. That's the argument. They all know it. Everybody knows it. Everybody knows it. Nobody thinks otherwise. But they can't say it, of course, because if they went up there in Congress and said, yeah, it has too many black people and we just don't want them to have 2 Senate seats, then, yeah. I actually appreciate Ben Shapiro's forthcomingness here. If you're very concerned about Washington, D.C. residents not having a senator, let's make them citizens of Virginia or Maryland. Oh, wait, that wouldn't accomplish your actual purpose of adding 2 more Democratic senators? What Ben Shapiro is doing here is a classic case of projection. For Ben Shapiro, because all he believes in is power, the only consideration to be had here is whether or not the enfranchisement of Washington, D.C. citizens would benefit or hurt his political party. So he's assuming that's the only reason why Democrats would do the exact same thing. Does that make sense? By the way, I like the idea, his idea, that having Virginia or Maryland annex Washington, D.C. would be a simpler solution than just giving them their own statehood, considering the fact that they're already a completely autonomous region that only is beholden to the federal government. Making them a state would actually be way less complicated than having Maryland or Virginia fucking schlorp them, okay? So what's happening here is Ben Shapiro is proposing an ahistorical, unprecedented, and less pragmatic solution because it would keep us from getting 2 more senators. That makes sense? Just want to make this clear, okay? It's all realpolitik. Republicans' only concern here is the political enfranchisement of their opponents. And Democrats vary. Some Democrats, I imagine, don't care about this too much, and blah-de-blah, and blah-blah. Some Democrats push for it a little more aggressively. For me, personally, just as a matter of principle, I think that the Republican Party is a terrorist organization, and that any action taken to disempower them is a humanitarian action for which we should be awarded medals galore, okay? I think that any action taken to politically disenfranchise Republicans is something that we should hail and celebrate. And if they get really mad about it, then that's very funny. That's a shit take. Is it now? Let's take a look at a wave of legislation. Hold on. Republican. Just a moment. Let's take a look at a wave of legislation that Republicans have been pushing for lately. GOP bills target protesters and absolve motorists who hit them. A Republican proposal in Indiana would bar anyone convicted of unlawful assembly. Minnesota. Oh no, wait. Where's the? Where is it? No, don't use the word car. There was there were a wave of laws that were passed to give more lenient legal protections to people who drive cars into protests, you know? I'll talk about this more in a future segment. Yeah. Oklahoma, is this happening? Didn't they also try to pass this in Florida? They also tried to do this. And they also tried to do this in Florida, right? Oh, yeah, there we go. Contentious Oklahoma bill to protect drivers who run over protesters signed into law. Look at that. Yeah, they passed it in Florida. Now they've passed it in Oklahoma. Yeah. Yeah, terrorist group. Yep. Yeah. What am I supposed to say here? BLM happens. What do? They give legal protections to people driving over protesters. Okay? It's going to pass in Iowa too. I don't doubt it. Party of terrorists. And this is just step one. I mean, there are a million other ways that I could defend the argument that they're a terrorist party. Capitol riot? No. This is just step one. Maybe we'll talk about it more in the future. Anyway, yeah. Christ. End this reality already? The Republican Party is the most dangerous organization on the face of the planet, significantly more so than ISIS. If you want to do this hard utilitarian calculus, okay, tell me, is there any organization on the planet capable of doing as much damage as the Republican Party is by forestalling climate change activism? Like, we're talking... what ISIS done is reprehensible, okay? The Republican Party can end the world. That is a couple scales above, actually. Several steps above. Massively, massively so. Yeah, no, the Republican Party is more capable than any other. Yeah. China? China has been a lot more responsible with climate change than America has proportionally. Didn't China even implement car licenses and like people can only drive every other day in China? There are some provinces in China where you can only drive every other day, depending on your car license, because they're trying to incentivize public transport and cut down on climate change. Is that I'm pretty sure I remember that. That's not true? They lead in carbon emissions. They have 1.4 billion people. Road space rationing in Beijing. I think I'll take the red pill. Okay, I think that the Chinese Communist Party is more responsible with climate change than the Republican Party. The Chinese Communist Party is at the head of the largest country on earth that's rapidly industrializing. We know that's going to cause problems. The Republican Party is at the head of a country capable of leading green energy. America could lead green energy. We could be pumping out trillions in green energy research, and we don't. And it's because we're still caught in discourse that the Republican Party invented.